Hey guys, Art Decline here, Average Picker. So we have a very special lock that we're going to take a look at tonight, and I want to give a big thanks to David Covington in Clover, South Carolina, for sending it to me. This is the lock and handle set from a room at the old Wagner Motel, but this is not just any lock. This is the lock from room 3, better known as the Wagner Motel murder room. That's weird. The power must have gone out. Let me just find a flashlight here. Let's see what we can. Yeah, you know what? Tell you what. I'm gonna grab some candles. I'll be right back. Okay, that's better. Right, so where was I? So the Wagner Motel, it was located just kind of northwest of due west, South Carolina, out on Old Highway 185. And the Wagner Motel ran from about the late 50s when it opened to sometime in the early 80s. It had a brief spike in popularity, changed hands, but then ended up shutting its doors around 1982. So we're going to be disassembling this lock, but to know a little bit more about it, this lock originally came on to the scene when it was used by Dr. Escape Clifton Anderson. Now, Clifton was a sort of small-time escape artist. He mostly toured around the southeast, performing things like county fairs, parties. He even served as pre-entertainment at some revivals. Now, as Anderson's kind of grand finale, he would escape from this sort of Egyptian-style sarcophagus Iron Maiden contraption that he had custom made. It was had these. Let me try to get this screw here. I might have to grab a screwdriver. But yeah, so this Iron Maiden had these sort of spring-loaded spikes in the back, and they would go off at various intervals. Now, Anderson's hands, they would be handcuffed initially on the outside. They would stick through these holes that had been cut in the front of the sarcophagus. Now, one of the things that really set Anderson apart was that he would take an intermission right before this final escape. And the intermission, the audience members could just come up and they could inspect this sarcophagus Iron Maiden thing he had pretty much to their heart's content. The spikes were fully working. They were sharp. Like I said, they were timed to go off at various intervals, though. Now, the final part of escaping this contraption was this lock, actually. Not this handle set, just this lock. But this lock, of course, it was gimmicked, right? So the lock itself had only... How do I get this? It's hard to see in here. The lock itself had only a single pin located in the first chamber. So this would allow pass inspection from the audience. It would allow the key to work. But essentially what this allowed Anderson to do was to be able to hold the suspense, I guess, of the act until the last possible moment before the spike would surely drive through his body. And at this point, he would actually tension the lock from the inside of it. And he would slip a hand out through one of those handcuff holes, and he would push a tiny pick. It was basically just the tip of a pick to that first pin. And of course, not only being one pin and being fairly high set, it didn't take very much at all to open it. So he could pretty much open. There we go. I think we got the lock out. He could pretty much open this lock at will, and thereby freeing himself. Now, Anderson, to no surprise, he's in a relationship with his assistant, Donna Limehouse. However, Donna, she grew to suspect, I'm just going to set this to the side here, that Dr. Escape was actually seeing her sister, Elizabeth. Okay? And she decided she was going to kill Anderson. And her method to do this was very simple. Janet simply removed a tiny bit of a rod that was used mostly for transportation. Oh, I'm losing something here. Looks like the back bit just fell off. Hope that's not going to be a problem. So Janet removed a bit of rod that was used to hold the contraption kind of together, mostly for the sake of transportation. She took this little bit and she filed it down and she inserted that into chamber 3 of the lock. Now, of course, by doing this, we know she would have ensured that Anderson wouldn't have been able to pick the lock. His pick would have been far too short, and he wouldn't have been expecting it at all. And on the off chance that police investigated, the lock itself would still appear to be gimmicked. Now, I will mention on a side note, the police, it turned out they did inspect the sarcophagus. They did not go as far as inspecting the pins in the lock, of course, as they seldom do. But it turned out they found out about the potential relationship, and they actually suspected Donna's sister. And after inspecting, they apparently did not understand the purpose of this rod, and they ended up arresting Elizabeth for Anderson Clifton's death. It is very hard to do this by candlelight. I'm hoping the power is going to come back on soon. So anyway, where was I? So after his death, a man named by the name of Robert Peel, he collected a lot of kind of small-time magic tricks and things like that. But he ended up purchasing the vast majority of Anderson's props. And along with that, he got his notebooks. And these notebooks detailed the escape. So that's how we know about the gimmicked pin that is supposedly inside this lock. So, eventually Robert Peel, he passed away, and his belongings, unfortunately, I guess, were sold at an estate auction. And that's how the lock eventually made its way to the Wagner Motel. We kind of lose track of it at that point. But the owner at the time was David Wagner, and it would seem David installed this lock and the handle set, which I've now set down there on the floor, shortly after a small fire had damaged several of the rooms. Now, it shouldn't be a surprise. The Wagner Motel, it was not very profitable, and it wasn't a very popular motel either, and it spent the majority of its life with quite a few vacancies. Chances are David purchased the lock, and he simply did the repairs himself on the cheap, buying the lock used and everything, as well as probably the doors. The doors of several of the rooms do not quite match everything else, and neither do the interiors. But this brings our story around to Janet Boyle. I need some light to find some pics here. But anyway, this Janet, right? So Janet was this mild and conservative elementary school teacher in Abbeville County, South Carolina. Now, Janet had had a rather tumultuous upbringing herself. She was raised in a very strict Baptist family, and she received also just a lot of abuse, verbal and physical, from her mother and father. Now, Janet was leaving school one day. God, I cannot see my tensioners. She was leaving school, and while driving home, she went past one of her students' houses, Debbie Reeves. Now, Debbie was one of her students, but she was not in that day. They simply suspected that maybe she had the flu or some other type of contagion. But when Janet drove by, she actually saw Debbie Reeves in her yard being beaten by her mother. And Janet, she pulled over immediately, and she saw that the girl was covered in blood. I can't even see this keyway. She pulled over, she got out of her car, she ran up, and she knocked Debbie's mother over. Oh, I can't even see the keyway. Yeah. You know what? Give me a minute. I'm going to go check the breakers and see if I can get some more light on in here. There we go. It's just nothing but a simple little breaker fail. So anyway, yeah, she knocked Janet's mother over, and witnesses say Janet's mother was screaming hysterically at her, at both of them. So Janet snatched Debbie up in her arms, forced her into her car, and she sped away. Let's see if we can get this picked here. We have to tension it the other direction. This should not be a hard pick. This lock, though, has not seen use for quite some time. Yeah, it's empty in there, guys. It is just, there's pin 1. And there is something in the back. There we go, and we're in. Okay, so anyway, Janet, she drove for nearly an hour, and she finally pulled into the Wagner Motel. Now, once there, she left Debbie in the car, and she entered the office, and she checked into room 4. Okay, now remember, this is the lock from room 3, but Janet checked into room 4. She then went out and she retrieved Debbie from the car and took her into her room, presumably to clean her up and check her injuries. It was during this process when it must have dawned on Janet that she had essentially just kidnapped one of her students. And not seeing any immediate injuries, though, she left Debbie in room 4 and she went out to the payphone to call the police to report herself. Now, the payphone is located on the back of the Wagner Motel, so this means Janet would have had to walk past several rooms around the front of the office and essentially circle around to the back of the hotel. So after placing, though, a call to the police, let's see, hold on. God, this thing is really, really sticky. This thing has not been messed with in a long time. Oh my God. Let's see, hold on, I don't want to, because we don't have a key. It is a very easy pick, though. Let's see if we can get the back off. Okay, sorry about the little cut there. I was having quite a difficult time getting that off. She'd gone around, she had called the police. Now, after placing this call, she circled back around to the front of the motel and she found David lying on the ground in front of room 3, which he had been finishing cleaning. He was bleeding profusely from his head, and he had a stack of freshly folded linens with him. And it was then that she heard a pop, and she saw Debbie actually plunging a long flathead screwdriver into the tires on her car. Guys, look at this core. I don't know if you can. We should flip the camera around for this. That thing is filed down too. I tell you what, let me get some more light in here. Let's get this flipped around and we can take a look at these pins. Okay, there we go. Take a look at this core, guys. That is some dodginess, isn't it? You can see, there it is. But anyway, yeah. So Debbie was stabbing out Janet's tires on her car with a flathead screwdriver. Now, Janet screamed. Debbie ran towards her with the screwdriver in an ice pick grip. And Janet ran into the first immediate room that she could get into, and this would have been room 3. She slammed the door and locked it, but we can see how little this would have locked a door. Now, Debbie stabbed repeatedly at that door with the screwdriver, and she plunged the blade of the screwdriver into the keyway and twisted. And the lock only being held really by that little gimmicked pin, and that bit of metal twisted and it snapped at pin 3. And in those final moments, Debbie was repeatedly plunging the screwdriver into Janet. Janet must have surely realized that the blood on Debbie was not hers. It was actually Debbie's father. And the incoherent screams of the mother, those were actually serving as warnings. Man, so there's our pin 1. Let's see what comes out of pin 3. Oh, you can't see. I shifted the camera down on you guys, sorry. So we've got that. Let's see what's going on upstairs. Oh, that guy jumped. I don't normally pull the springs, but we'll go ahead and pull them in this case. Let's see. I'm going to pull it off camera to get the spring. There we go. Oh, that is a chewed up spring, guys. Okay, so we know all these chambers should be empty, except for 3. 3, we should find broken pins. And there we have it. We have a single pin in chamber 1 and a sheared pin in chamber 3. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the Wagner Motel murder lock. Happy Halloween, guys.